A brand that receives a lot of praise, but equally neglect. Whether it is because of the name on their dials or the prices of their pieces, Grand Seiko is a watch tailored for a very specific audience. On one side you have the person who wants an extremely reliable watch, built to excellent standards, and on the other, enthusiasts, who know what they are receiving is very under the radar and is more technically competent than a large majority of watches in the industry. As a foundation, we should see these pieces differently from their competitors on other continents. I do not view Grand Seiko watches the same as I would a Rolex, Omega or Patek Philippe, and I don't think you should either. With a lot of these watches that you will be seeing, Grand Seiko offers something completely different, and that is what makes them unique. This discussion will be simple, and will focus on a handful of watches that I have cherry-picked from their catalogue, everything from standard sports pieces to more dressier pieces, watches that have plain and textured dials, and their movements range from high beat to quartz and spring drives. The focus of this discussion is going to be all about their designs, their individual elements, and ultimately honing in on what makes Grand Seiko a brand that you should pay attention to. In front of you we have 5 pieces. The Snowflake, reference SBGA211. The Peacock, SBGJ227. The Automatic GMT, SBGM021. The 9F GMT, SBGN005. And the High Beat Diver, SBGH255G. You have no idea how many times it took to get those references right. Let's start with the Snowflake, arguably the most iconic modern piece in their catalogue, and the embodiment of what the brand strives for, that being detail. The watch gives off an excellent first impression when you see it up close, but admittedly, it looks very much like a Seiko SARB to the layperson. At least the base SBGA211 model looks plain. And this is a double-edged sword. It might be too simple for some, but to others it fits the build perfectly, and it has a huge reputation amongst enthusiasts. But what is more fascinating about this piece is what has come from it, because it has been the foundation of their modern lineup that has now resulted in some of the most remarkable models they offer. The name Snowflake, for those of you who are new to these watches, is linked to the dial. Grand Seiko always bases their products with a compelling narrative. Made in-house by artisans of their Shiojiri workshop, the dial is made to resemble freshly fallen snow. And just that alone is enough to make a watch enthusiast interested. It is such a basic concept. And focusing on the texture, it appears almost like a combination between thick parchment paper and, well, snow. These dials are entirely unique to the watch, and that immediately brings the name of the watch home. Nothing complicated. And more importantly, what I like, is that it is nothing that needs to be read to you about the watch. You pick it up, look at it, someone will say Snowflake, and you would nod your head in agreement. This is called visual storytelling in the design industry, the art of being able to express an idea through visual language. That is a good foundation to explain how Grand Seiko operates with their pieces, and you should keep this in mind as we discuss the pieces further. There is a strong focus on making design the hero of their watches, whether that is in the method of their finishing, the materials, the balance or unbalance of their dials. Design and detail are key. Moving to the case, every Grand Seiko employs a finishing called zoratsu, meaning mirror blade. And if you are well versed with most watch cases, you can immediately see that the finishing has been handled differently with these pieces. Sharp, angular, but simple. And with Grand Seiko cases in general, the word balanced comes to mind. Almost unadorned. An equal blend of brushing and polishing throughout. Another element to note is that this watch is made from a titanium alloy, and the result is that you get the bright luster of stainless steel with the hardness and lightness of titanium. Returning to the dial, the hands and the batons are just masterfully done. There is so much attention to detail in the way that they are handled. Every edge of every baton and hand is faceted and highly polished. It is almost as if the material is treated the same as how a diamond would be treated, and this image does it justice. Also notice the heat-blued seconds hand for an added effect. And quickly touching on the watch's movement, it incorporates a spring drive movement, something that Grand Seiko has made into a household name. I talk about it at length in the video linked in the corner if you are interested. The movement is an amalgamation between the accuracy of quartz and the mechanics of an automatic, and just as how motor cars are going through the hybridization process, so too are the movements that Grand Seiko offers. Between the 7 and the 8 position is a power reserve indicator, and like the rest of the details on the dial, it has been treated extremely well. There is beauty to unbalance, and the placement of the indicator on this watch is an example of that. There is texture highlighting the graduations of the reserve, and the placement of the scale has been neatly recessed into the dial. Also, an element that I appreciate is how prominent the date complication is placed. Not only is it large and clearly defined, but it also has a polished window surrounding it. Just looking at the watch in its entirety, it really is an excellent foundation for Grand Seiko. There is balance and attention to detail throughout the watch, and that is why it is a great starting point. This watch could serve you religiously for the rest of your life. And this is just the beginning. With the foundations of the watch out of the way, the next piece in the lineup is the Grand Seiko Peacock, a personal favorite of mine. And what immediately brings your attention to the watch is the striking dial. The longer you look at it, and the closer you look at it, the more it draws you in. The name Peacock is again derived from its dial, this time because of the texture and the way the pattern represents the plumage of the bird's feathers when they are splayed open. And to bring it home, the color also represents the primary color of the bird. In some lights it is green, in others it is teal, and in low light it is a dark blue. It has to be one of the most vibrant dials that they offer, and is by far the watch's unique selling point. It uses a high beat GMT complication, so instead of beating at the usual frequency of 28,000 beats per minute, the watch beats at 36,000, meaning that the hand sweep looks almost electronic, even though it is completely automatic. The finishing on the piece is the same as the Snowflake, with a focus on balancing the brushing and polishing. And returning to the dial, the batons and the hands have received the same amount of attention. And one of the best color choices was the golden spot color on the GS logo and the GMT hand. It comes together as such a neat and clearly defined watch. This is a perfect one watch for anybody, let alone an enthusiast. It simply does it all. It is understated but also vibrant. Dressed casually or formally, the watch doesn't look out of place. And when compared to the more basic Snowflake, the Peacock has the complication and just the right amount of visual complexity for it to never come across as a boring watch. Utterly beautiful. The next GMT is a deviation away from the dressy sports watch and comes across, at least at first, as more of a utility-inspired watch with a touch of classicism. It is not difficult to discern that this piece was inspired by vintage watches, and this piece caught my eye because of how well balanced the dial is. Again, the exercise of understanding balance with a watch's dial, but utilizing the open space wisely, is what makes it so visually appealing at first. The cream dial is so much more exciting than a plain white dial to look at, and the small blue GMT hand that links to the inset GMT numerals is intelligent. It is an intelligent piece of design, and that is how I would best describe this piece. It is another clear-cut example of a Grand Seiko GMT that could serve someone for the rest of their lives, simply because it is basic, utilitarian, but also fascinating to look at. One of the newest watches in Grand Seiko's catalogue, the latest 9F GMT, has brought a lot of attention to the brand. This piece gives off the impression of a more sports-oriented piece, with arguably a few influences from other well-known brands. Some influencers on this platform already own them, and from what we've seen, they enjoy them greatly, for a few reasons. Let's begin with the 9F Quartz Movement. It is one of the most superlative quartz movements ever made, with an accuracy that falls within plus or minus 5 seconds a year. So already you are receiving a watch that is incredibly accurate, and that appeals to many sticklers. But then looking at the watch itself, its design is a big departure from the pieces we have seen already. It incorporates crown guards, a more brushed finish. There is a great focus on this watch being again a utility for the wearer, and this watch would work in any environment, in any setting, with the added value of extreme accuracy. I see this being used by mountain bikers, hikers, or anyone who leads an active lifestyle. The two pieces offer something different, where one has a brilliant blue dial combined with a red GMT hand, the other uses a more grey, olive drab finish that is then accentuated by a yellow GMT hand. Yes, these watches are targeting a different audience, that much is clear, and I would admit I don't see them to be anywhere near as visually refined or complex as the Snowflake or the Peacock. They have lost some aspects of the case design that I wish they had kept, and they do take liberty from other watches. But that still doesn't affect the watch's wearability and versatility on a daily basis. Once again, the texture on the dial is striking, and the integration of the luminova on the hands and indices is a very nice exercise of creating something with restraint that also doubles as a highly functional tool. Finally, the diver, the Grand Seiko diver. Now this watch has seen revisions over the years, but this new model in particular is something to marvel at. It is such an aggressive looking watch, like a diver should be. It is a no-nonsense tool. The angles on the lugs, the overall width of the piece, and the intelligent method of using the dial with a studded texture really makes it visually exciting. With many divers, their excess size is a hindrance, especially on their dials, since many waste space. But this model manages to keep a strong focus on the dial architecture and the balance between the hands and the indices. One integration that is really impressive and subtle is the date integration at the 4 o'clock position. It is a placement that is seldom seen, but does a few things. It keeps the dial visually symmetrical, and the offset placement doesn't attract the eye as much. It has a good way of blending into the background, but not being a cause of unbalance. The bezel uses an appropriate typeface and is fully graduated. Like I've often said about the Seiko Prospex and other divers, with a lot of their pieces there is a clear understanding about what makes an appealing bezel insert. I would even go so far to say that there is a better understanding with these pieces than some of the major Swiss manufacturers. Just look at the small arrow indicators underneath the numerals, for example. And where the previous generation of spring drive diver slipped up visually in a few areas, this new high beat model really brings home a sense of clarity in their thought process. Finally, a dive watch with a depth rating at 600 meters, without the requirement of a helium release valve, tells me that they have managed to secure the crystal to the case in a more elaborate way. Again, this watch has had a lot of attention put into its finishing, and going full circle, returning to the Zuratsu polishing of the case, there is a fine balance of polished and brushed finishing throughout. All the while, this watch has kept its identity as a Grand Seiko, and not just become a generic-looking dive watch, something that a lot of other brands have fallen prey to. Returning all the pieces back into the picture again, it is clear that, just from the handful that I have selected, these pieces offer a lot of variety between each other. Some are simpler than others, some are more elaborate, some are more accurate, some appeal to larger audiences, but collectively they all are exciting in their own way. And in that variety, Grand Seiko has managed to situate themselves as watches that can appeal to broad audiences. What are my thoughts on Grand Seiko? I've never said this about a watch company before, but I see them to be a watch for a designer. And I think that comes down to how these pieces respond to the brief so differently from their competitors. They all look far from generic and incorporate practices that are not found anywhere else. Of course, I have favorites, and there are pieces that do not appeal to me, but more than most brands, I see Grand Seiko as a company that is continually trying to push the envelope in the watch industry, and they are slowly coming to the attention of more and more people. I love the fact that they are hybridizing movements. Some might think it is cheap or an apocalypse for mechanical watches, but more than anything else, the experimentation with all of these aspects is a fascinating exercise that many turn their noses up to. Why does Grand Seiko fascinate me? It is simply because they appeal to the designer in me, and that is something that no other watch brand has managed to do as effectively yet. So what was the point of this discussion? I talked you through the watches and highlighted some of their details that stood out to me, and hope that you noticed something different about each of them. But why should you pay attention to Grand Seiko? Yes, they are a company that is trying to compete with more successful competitors, but they are approaching the competition in a different way. With the majority of their watches, they are weaving their work and concepts with the art of storytelling. I have learned that it is important to base your work with a narrative. It makes the product all the more interesting. It resonates differently with someone. Now granted, the likes of Omega and Rolex don't need to create visual stories to such extents with their watches anymore. They both have phenomenal histories and backgrounds. Just the likes of me and influencers explaining how their watches were some of the pioneers, being worn by people who accomplished great things, is good enough to sell you on the pieces. You are in a way buying into that history yourself. But with Grand Seiko they offer something different, something more intimate. They incorporate their own inspirations and stories into their watches, the same way that any prestigious artisan should. They base their dials on nature and the elements. They explore what it means to create balance and unbalance with their pieces. There is an understanding of developmental history with their movements. And all of these minute aspects cater to different types of people. As a result from all of this, you receive something that is completely different, that has been approached differently by people who are in a completely different building, seeing around the constraints that afflict so many others who are unwilling to change their approach. That is why you should pay attention to Grand Seiko, and can ultimately appreciate their watches for a different reason.